The night was heavy with dust and the smell of sweat-soaked wood. Out on the far edge of town, where lantern lights struggled to reach, a young cowboy pushed open the saloon doors for the first time. His boots struck the creaking floorboards with a hesitance that betrayed his youth. Though he carried himself tall, his hat brim pulled low enough to shadow the uncertainty in his eyes. Folks turned to look, some out of habit, others out of curiosity, because everyone in that part of the West knew newcomers were either trouble or the poor souls who got tangled in it. He was no outlaw, no gunslinger with a bloody record. Truth be told, he was barely a man grown, still carrying the quiet awkwardness of someone who hadn't yet lived long enough to be hardened by drink or women. His revolver, however, was a different story. It rested at his hip like it belonged there, polished and cared for, as if it were the one thing in his life he truly understood. He had never touched a woman, never shared her laughter in the late hours, or her tears in the quiet of dawn. Yet he handled that gun like it was an extension of his soul. Folks said a man's reputation could be born out of nothing but rumor. And in his case, whispers traveled fast that he might not know the sweetness of love. But his aim could split a bottle at 50 paces without spilling a drop at the bar. A widow sat with her back straight and her chin tilted just enough to command the room. She was no stranger to the eyes that followed her every move, nor to the silence that fell when her presence settled in. Loss had etched itself into her, but it had not broken her. Her husband had been buried out on the hill where the prairie wind never stopped blowing, leaving her with a farm too large to manage and a heart too heavy to carry. Men approached her oftensome with pity, others with boldness, but she had learned to wave them away with a look that warned them she didn't need saving. Still, there was something about the boy who had just walked in. He didn't swagger, didn't leer the way others did. He looked as though he carried a burden heavier than his years should allow. And though his hand stayed near the revolver at his side, there was no malice in it, only readiness. The widow's eyes lingered on him longer than she meant to, and in a place where glances often meant invitations. That was enough to set tongues wagging. The saloon itself seemed to breathe with tension. Cards slapped against tables, coins clinked into pots, and glasses filled with cheap whiskey caught the lamplight. Yet beneath it all, the hush of expectation grew. Men who'd ridden the trails knew a story was about to begin, the kind that towns remembered long after the dust settled. The young cowboy had no kin nearby, no friends to speak for him, and no past to defend, only the way he stood, quiet yet unyielding. Like a man who didn't plan to run from whatever came his way, he ordered nothing. Not even water, just leaned against the counter near where the widow sat. His silence stretched long enough for the barkeep to frown and for a few gamblers to glance up. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, the kind that made a man listen, even if the words themselves were plain. But before he could say more, the batwing doors slammed open again, and the air shifted. 3 riders stepped inside, their boots muddy, their spurs jingling with the careless rhythm of men who owned the room before they even crossed it. The tallest one carried a sneer fixed beneath a crooked mustache, and his eyes landed first on the widow, then on the boy. The silence snapped into sharp edges. Everyone knew the riders by reputation. They weren't here for drink or cards. They thrived on fear, and they had just found a new reason to draw it out. The widow's hand tightened around the edge of her glass. Though her face betrayed nothing, the boy's fingers brushed the worn grip of his revolver, not out of impulse, but with the certainty of someone who had been waiting for this moment, even if he hadn't known it until now. The tallest rider laughed, a sound that filled the room like broken glass. He said something cruel, something that made the men at the tables look away and the women lowered their gazes. But the boy didn't look away. His eyes stayed fixed, steady beneath the brim of his hat, unblinking as if he'd been carved from stone. The widow felt a flicker inside her chest, something she hadn't felt since before her loss, an unspoken question of whether fate had just shifted in her favor or set her on a darker path. No one in that saloon knew what would happen next. Some thought the boy would falter, that his inexperience would betray him. Others whispered that a legend was about to be born, not from years of scars and whiskey, but from a single moment when a young man with no past proved himself against the shadows of the West. The widow drew in a breath. The boy's hand hovered near his holster, and the tallest rider took one bold step forward. The sound of boots against wood echoed like thunder, and time seemed to stretch thin, as if the whole world were holding itself still, waiting for the first move. And just like that, the saloon froze between silence and fire. Caught in the breath before a storm no one could stop, the tall rider stood with his hand hanging loose at his side, the faint grin on his face saying more than words ever could. His men fanned out a step behind him, taking up space in a way that reminded everyone they weren't strangers here. Folks in town had seen their kind before, men who lived by the gun and never left behind anything but trouble. The barkeep wiped the counter in slow circles, trying to appear calm though his shoulders had gone stiff. No one wanted to be caught in the middle. Yet every pair of eyes in the room was locked on the young cowboy who hadn't spoken more than a word since stepping through the door. The widow shifted in her chair.
Eyes steady but cautious.
She had lived long enough to know when violence was about to show its teeth. The boy beside her wasn't just another drifter passing through. There was something in the way he held himself, quiet and steady, that told her he carried a purpose. Even if it wasn't clear what that purpose was yet, she could see the way his fingers hovered near his revolver, not itching to draw but ready, as though his gun was the only part of him that knew exactly what to do. The rider leaned in, his voice sharp enough to cut through the room. He spoke the widow's name like a man testing his luck, stretching out each syllable as if he wanted everyone to hear it. The saloon's air tightened, and a few men shuffled in their seats, pretending to focus on their cards, though no one could play with such weight pressing down on them. The widow's jaw tensed, but she didn't answer. She had faced men like this before, and silence was her strongest shield. The boy finally moved. He shifted his stance just enough to face the rider, his hat brim still shadowing his expression. The rider chuckled at that, mistaking quiet for weakness. But the boy's stillness wasn't weakness. It was patience, the kind that comes from someone who had seen hardship in different shapes. Even if not in the ways the world usually measured a man, the tension stretched, yet no one dared to break it. And then, without warning, the rider stepped back and slapped the dust from his gloves against his thigh. His laughter rolled through the room, loud and mocking, though his eyes never lost their sharpness. He didn't pull his gun, not yet. Instead, he turned to his men, muttering something low that carried just enough to make clear they weren't finished here. They pushed past the tables, knocking a chair to the floor as they moved toward the far end of the bar. It was a warning, a reminder that this wasn't over. The boy stayed rooted in place, his revolver untouched. The widow let out a quiet breath, the kind you don't even realize you've been holding. Around them, the saloon slowly found its rhythm. Again cards slapped. Dice rattled. Boots tapped against the floor, but the shadow of what had just happened hung in the air like smoke later that night. Long after the riders had gone, the boy remained at the bar. He hadn't ordered a drink, hadn't touched the glass of water that had been set before him. The widow, too, stayed where she was, her hand resting near the empty bottle she had carried through the evening. For a long time, neither spoke. Words weren't always needed in the West, and sometimes silence said more than any question could. But at last she turned her head toward him, studying the lines of his face. "You new to these parts?" she asked, her tone even, though it held the weight of someone who needed to know whether this stranger was a help or a burden. The boy nodded once. "Just passing through," he said. His voice was quiet, yet it carried the kind of certainty that made her believe he had more reason to be here than he was letting on. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing slightly. Passing through towns like this don't usually bring peace. "What are you really after?" He hesitated, then glanced at the door where the riders had disappeared earlier. "Sometimes trouble finds you whether you're looking for it or not." The widow studied him for another moment before she gave a small, knowing smile. She had heard words like that before, but something in the way he said it told her this boy wasn't just running from something. He was moving toward it. Word of what had happened spread quick. By morning, whole town seemed to know about the young cowboy who had stood firm against the riders without so much as flinching. Some folks admired him for it, whispering that maybe he was the kind of man who could finally stand up to the outlaws who had been bleeding the town dry for months. Others shook their heads, saying he was a fool for stepping into trouble that wasn't his. In towns like this, hope and fear walked side by side, and no one knew which one would win out. The widow went about her day as always, tending to what she could on the small piece of land left to her, though the memory of the boy lingered at the edges of her thoughts. She had seen many men try to play hero, and most ended up 6 feet under for their trouble. Yet there was something different about this one, something she couldn't quite name. The boy, for his part, kept to himself. He walked the dirt streets with quiet steps, his eyes always scanning, not in nervousness, but in habit. He wasn't looking for a fight, yet he never turned from the possibility of one either. Folks noticed that about him. Even the sheriff, an older man who had long ago learned that keeping peace often meant turning a blind eye, watched him from a distance with the kind of interest reserved for men who might upset the fragile balance of the town at night. The boy often found himself back at the saloon, not for drink or for cards, but because it was the only place where the noise of others dulled the quiet thoughts that chased him. The widow was usually there too, and though neither sought the other out, their paths crossed often enough that the air between them began to feel familiar. Still, nothing was said that might hint at what either of them carried inside. The riders, however, hadn't forgotten. They lingered at the edge of town, waiting for the right moment to remind everyone who held the real power. Whispers reached the saloon of stolen cattle, a farm stripped clean, of threats left at doorsteps. Folks knew it was only a matter of time before they came back to finish what they had started, and so the story deepened, not with the sound of gunfire, but with the slow tightening of a rope around the whole town. The boy remained steady, the widow remained watchful, and the townsfolk waited with bated breath, unsure whether the young stranger was their salvation or just another spark that would set everything aflame. The days rolled on, each one heavier than the last. Dust settled thicker on the streets, and even the wind seemed to whisper of the storm to come. The boy's revolver gleamed under the fading light of each evening, a silent reminder that sooner or later someone would draw, and when they did, everything would change. And while no one could yet say how or when, the town knew one truth with absolute certainty: fate had walked in the night the young cowboy opened those saloon doors, and it hadn't left since. Word of the rider sat on the town like a weight. Days stretched thin while everyone waited for the snap. The sheriff walked slower, hat tipped low, trying to hear trouble before it rattled the windows. The storekeeper counted nails and beans twice, then slid the shotgun behind the counter, where it did more as a warning than anything else. Out past the last fence, the prairie looked wide and kind as always, yet the wind came with a bite that said not to trust it. Folks called it frontier weather. It made a person feel watched. The young cowboy kept to a steady routine. Up before sun, he walked the edge of town and practiced with the revolver. He never fired, not once. He worked on draw and balance and where his feet went. He did it with care, the way a piano man might work the keys even when the room is silent. People noticed. Some took comfort in the discipline. Others muttered that a man who trained that hard was either looking for salvation or a fight. He never said which. The widow spent her mornings at the well and her afternoons with the grim tasks of keeping a small ranch alive. She repaired a gate by herself, drove off a stray coyote with a shout, and bargained with a cattle buyer who tried to shave her price because she stood there alone. Each evening she washed her hands until the dust let go, then tied her hair back and went into town. She did not go to be seen. She went because a person gets lonely with only wind for company, and because there is a comfort in the clatter of a saloon when your house is quiet. That is where she and the boy spoke more. Not much, not often. Short talk about weather and fence wire and the shape of a day, but every word carried a weight neither of them named. The barkeep cleaned the same glass when they were near each other, pretending to mind his business while he minded it hard. The piano man, who had not played a happy tune in years, seemed to find one that sounded almost like hope. Though he worked the keys soft so no one would call him a liar, the riders had a hand in many things. They liked to tilt the town around the axis of their want. They charged a fee to trail cattle through the pass. They took a cut of the card tables on Saturday nights. They told the stagecoach when it could run and when it could not. People called it a tax under breath. The sheriff called it trespass when he spoke alone to the sky. No one said the other word that would have forced a standoff. The riders worked for a man most had never seen up close. Someone who owned a long strip of land east of the river and kept his boots to clean for dust. He had an eye on water rights and a plan that smelled like the railroad. The riders were his shadow hands. One afternoon, a boy from the livery ran down Main Street shouting about smoke. A small homestead west of town had caught fire. The town turned out with buckets and blankets, but they arrived too little more than char and a smell that stayed in the nose. The family had been away at a cousin's christening, so no one was hurt. Yet the message was plain as a sign. The fire had started at the fence line where a fresh brand had been cut into a post. The brand belonged to the man beyond the river. The sheriff walked the ash with a careful eye. He found a boot mark that matched the riders. He found a coin stamped with a railroad emblem, pressed into the dirt like a promise. He pocketed the coin and said nothing to anyone. He was too old to rush at a wall without a ladder. A new thread braided into the story then. The preacher, a kind man with a weathered face, came to the widow's porch with two boys who were not his own. Their father had gone south after work and never come back. The preacher asked the widow if she could spare milk and a bed for one night. She said yes before the question was finished. The boys slept on quilts near the stove and woke to a breakfast they ate so fast it made her smile. The kindness turned to a quiet burden when the preacher asked if she could keep them for a week while he spoke to kin. She agreed, though her farm was barely a match for one person, let alone three. The town watched and whispered that she had taken on more than she could carry. The sheriff watched and saw something else. People anchor to each other when storms start to circle. The young cowboy began showing up at the widow's land at daybreak, saying nothing more than that fences mend better with 4 hands than 2. He worked like a person who understood the rhythm of chores. He lifted without boasting and stepped back when praise tried to find him. He showed the boys how to oil a hinge and how to spot tracks in the dirt for snakes. The widow saw his care around the children and felt something new press against her ribs. It was not heat or surprise. It was steadiness. She had not felt steadiness in a long time. The riders did not miss any of this. They circled the edge of her property one evening, close enough to let the horses be seen, far enough to claim they were on public trail. A small, menacing ritual. The tall one lifted 2 fingers from his hat when the widow came out onto the porch. He looked past her to the young cowboy working the gate and smiled like a man who had already chosen the day he would force his hand. He turned and rode off without a word. The dust behind him wrote a promise across the fading sky, while the widow fought to keep her land upright. A second subplot formed in town. The storekeeper, a careful man with a ledger brain, had been adding numbers that did not settle. Freight costs were rising, even though the road had not washed out and the stagecoach ran on time. Paper orders from East came with a new surcharge for security. The storekeeper asked the coach driver about it and got a shrug that hid fear. The driver had heard a rumor that the riders were charging protection fees on all cargo headed west of the river. That meant food, rope, medicine, and bullets. It meant the town was paying the riders to keep itself safe from the riders. The storekeeper told the sheriff in a voice that shook from anger he was not used to feeling. The sheriff listened, then brought out the railroad coin and set it on the table between them. The coin shined like a small sun. 2 men with little taste for speeches looked at it the way farmers look at a sky that refuses to rain. The conflict shifted from a private problem to a civic one. The people did not call a meeting. Out here meetings happen without chairs. Men leaned on hitch rails at dusk and spoke in low tones. Women filled water buckets and traded short reports like scouts. The piano man and the barkeep passed more than whiskey between them. Even the farrier, who disliked words the way a horse dislikes thunder, came down the street to say he had seen the riders talking with a man in a suit near the river bridge. A suit is rare on the prairie. It fit too well on a frame that had never split wood. The young cowboy kept working, as if the best answer to gathering trouble was to keep a gate from sagging. He spoke little. When folks pushed him for history, he gave pieces without edges. He had grown up north, learned to ride on a horse that liked to bite, learned to shoot from a ranch hand who believed in quiet hours. His father had worked hard and died young. His mother had a laugh that filled a room and then one day went missing from it. He came south because he had heard a man's luck can change when the land changes under his boots. That was all he said. The rest he kept in the space between breath and thought. The sheriff, feeling the town lean toward a decision, went to the widow's house at dusk. He found the boy mending tack and the two children racing each other with sticks that pretended to be rifles. He tipped his hat at the widow and asked if he might borrow the young cowboy for a spell. They walked to the fence line, where the first of the stars was waking. The sheriff told the boy he did not like using other people to fight his battles, yet there are times when a steady hand is the only answer. He said the riders were taking more each week, and that he believed a man with a clean coat was paying them to do it. He asked the boy what he planned to do if the riders pushed first. The boy said he would not start what he could not finish, but he would not back away either. The sheriff nodded like a coachman taking the reins on a rough road. He told the boy to be careful with his heroics. People die for towns. Towns seldom die for people. A hard wind came 2 nights later. With it came news. A freight wagon turned over on the pass. The driver said a shot had spooked his team, though no one saw where it came from. A crate broke and spilled tools stamped with the railroad emblem. The sheriff, the storekeeper, and the young cowboy hiked up at dawn to look. The pass was narrow and mean. The tracks told a story of horses above the road, not below. The riders had set up on the ridge and fired one warning shot. The message was as simple as arithmetic: pay or lose. The sheriff stood there with hands on hips, and for a moment he looked every year he had ever lived. Then he said something without moving his mouth much. It sounded like enough. A few in town wanted to hire guards from a mining camp to the north. Others said that would only bring more guns and more grief. A rancher pushed to sell land to the railroad and let the new owners deal with the riders. The preacher said giving away land guts a town worse than hunger. The widow kept her opinion tight, though her eyes said she would rather fight than sign anything that gave away her husband's sweat. The young cowboy said nothing until the room got too loud. Then he asked if anyone knew where the riders slept. The room grew quiet in a hurry. No one wanted to admit they had watched that close. The sheriff finally said he had seen smoke to the south near a cut of rock shaped like a broken tooth. The boy nodded and said that kind of rock holds sound like a bottle. A camp there would hear riders coming in but would not hear a lone man on foot. The thought hung between them like a hook. Another subplot opened when the piano man pulled the widow aside after a set. He said he had once played in a mining town where the railroad sent men to mark parcels ahead of official papers. He said the trick worked like this. The sponsor hired a gang to make life hard until prices fell. Then the sponsor bought cheap and claimed he was rescuing a failing place. He said if the town did not make a stand, it would wake one morning to find itself owned by a boardroom far away. The widow asked how that town survived. The piano man said it didn't. Folks drifted off one by one until the wind played through the empty rooms. He looked at her then, and the way he looked told her he did not want to play a slow song while this town died. The tension pushed higher when a letter arrived for the widow, carried by a rider who would not look her in the eye. The letter bore a neat script and a seal with the same railroad symbol. It offered to buy her land for a price that would have seemed fair to anyone who did not know what home costs. The letter said the company needed a small holding for a water station and would pay within 2 days. It promised good work for the boys once they were of age. At the bottom, in ink heavy as tar, it stressed that kind offers do not wait long. She folded the paper with hands that did not shake and slid it into a drawer. That night she stood on the porch until the moon climbed high. The young cowboy stayed up the hill near the barn, keeping watch without saying he was. He woke before dawn to coyotes yipping, then to a sound he knew too well. A single horse at a canter. He reached for the revolver and waited. A figure rode into the yard without hurry, holding a wide envelope in one hand. It was the tall rider. He swung down and smiled a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. He said the man beyond the river wanted to sweeten the pot and that the offer now included cash up front. He said it would be a shame if someone took the well rope or left a gate open. He kept his words smooth, kept his hands away from his holster, kept his gaze on the house where a lamp had just flared behind a curtain. The young cowboy did not answer. He stood still as a fence post. The rider tipped his hat and rode away, humming like he owned the tune. By noon, the whole town knew about the letter and the visit. Different people had different advice. Sell and start over. Wait and see. Fight and drag everyone into a war. The widow listened and thanked them and kept her words short. She worked through the afternoon wearing a look that said her mind was busy counting costs. The boys sensed the strain and tried to be brave by being loud. They whooped as they chased one another, then helped carry wood like small men. The young cowboy fixed a loose hinge and pretended not to see the worry on the widow's face. Because sometimes the kindest thing is to let another person keep their private storm. That night the sheriff came by with news of his own. A stagecoach was scheduled to run with a strongbox for the bank. He expected the riders to make a play for it. He hoped to use the run as bait, to watch how the gang moved, maybe find their camp for sure. He asked the young cowboy if he would ride shotgun. The boy looked at the widow, then back at the sheriff, and said yes. He did not say this would pull trouble toward all of them. Everyone in the room knew it without saying. The plan twisted the air tight as a drum. The stage would roll at first light, wheels greased and horses fresh. The sheriff would follow at distance with 2 men he trusted. The storekeeper would spread a rumor about the strongbox to make sure the riders heard. The piano man would keep quiet with his hands for once and offer a silent prayer. The widow did not like any of it. Yet she helped the boy check his revolver and laid out a scarf to wrap over his mouth against the dust. She told the boys to keep near the house until noon and to mind the dog. Then she stepped closer to the young cowboy than she ever had and said 3 words that held more than they carried. Come back safe. The morning rose pale and cold. The stagecoach rattled out of town while windows watched. The young cowboy rode beside the driver, hat low, eyes on the horizon where ridges stacked like folded blankets. The road crossed a shallow creek, then tilted toward the pass. Birdsong gave way to thin silence. The driver kept his lines tight. The boy kept one gloved hand near the revolver and his thoughts on the map the sheriff had sketched in the dirt. Nothing moved on the ridges, which is sometimes the loudest sign of all. Back in town, the widow stood on the porch. Arms wrapped around herself against a chill the sun could not warm. She looked toward the south and tried to read the sky. The sheriff waited at the edge of town, mouth set, watching dust that might be wind and might be hooves. The storekeeper stood in his doorway pretending to stack sacks. The piano man stared at the silent keys as if a song could pull the coach home by will alone. Up on the passe, flicker broke the ridge like a wink. Then another. The driver saw it and did not speak. The young cowboy saw it and breathed once, deep and even, and told his heart to slow. Rounding the next bend, the coach rolled into the mouth of a narrow cut where rock pushed close on both sides. The world went quiet, the way a crowd goes quiet when a curtain lifts. The riders appeared on the ridge above, horses stamping, rifles resting lazy across their laps. The tall rider eased his horse forward and called down a greeting that did not greet. The driver drew the team to a halt. The young cowboy lifted his chin and met the stare aimed straight at him. The sheriff, far behind, saw shapes on the high ground and pressed his heels in, urging speed without raising dust. Wind moved through the cut with a slow hush. The tall rider smiled like a man who has all the cards and enjoys showing one at a time. He said the road was closed until fees were paid. He said the fee had gone up on account of recent disrespect. He said a young man sitting high might find it easier to climb down while he still could. The young cowboy did not move. The driver whispered that maybe this was a good day to think hard. The boy reached up, tugged the scarf higher across his face, and set both boots firm on the rail. He kept his hands visible. He counted the riders without moving his eyes, then counted again. Somewhere beyond the ridge a hawk cried once. The sound cut clean and faded fast. The tall rider lifted 2 fingers. The men behind him shifted in their saddles. One reached for a rope, another for a rifle. Not to fire, but to show the line between talk and the thing that comes after talk. The young cowboy let his hand fall to the butt of the revolver, not fast, not slow, as if he were testing the fit. On the far side of the rocks, Hidden in shadow, someone else watched. A man in a neat coat stood beside a horse with polished tack, eyes narrow, lips pressed thin. He turned a railroad coin over in his palm, as if deciding whether to spend it. He nodded once to himself, then raised his hand to make a different signal than the one the riders expected. The sheriff, still out of sight, saw the glint of the raised hand and knew this was not only a robbery, it was a shaping. He kicked his horse into a run, understanding he might reach the bend a heartbeat too late. In town, the widow pressed a hand to the railing and felt the wood tremble with the footfall of something she could not see. At the mouth of the cut, the tall rider's smile thinned. The young cowboy's breath steadied to a slow drum. The driver's hands began to sweat on the lines. The wind died. The world narrowed to a stretch of road no longer than a barn and wide enough for choices. It would not turn back. The tall rider dropped his fingers. The neat man in the shadow raised his. Two commands crossed each other like blades. The young cowboy drew. The ridge answered with motion like water over stone. In the next second, the one the town would talk about for years fell toward them with the weight of a hammer, still just out of reach. The draw was not yet complete when the ridge erupted in noise. Horses shifted, iron scraped leather, and the clatter of rifles filled the cut like a storm breaking through narrow walls. The tall rider barked a command, but his words were drowned beneath the sudden confusion of his own men glancing toward the figure in the ebb. Shadows who had raised a different hand. The young cowboy felt it in his bones, the split in command, the half-second pause where no one knew whose order to follow. It was the kind of pause that could shape everything. The stage driver gritted his teeth and whispered a prayer under his breath, hands gripping the reins so tight the leather bit into his palms. The team of horses tossed their heads, restless, feeling the tension climb through the air. The sheriff was still pounding across the hard ground behind, close enough to see dust rising, but too far to shout a warning. Every heart in that canyon seemed to be beating in time with the same ticking clock, and each tick dragged slow as tar. The young cowboy stood tall on the side rail of the coach, revolver now resting in his hand but still angled down. He did not fire, not yet. His silence was louder than any gunshot. His eyes stayed locked on the tall rider, reading the smallest twitch of muscle, the faintest shift in stance. He was waiting for the tell, the moment that separates bluff from action. The tall rider gave it away in the way his jaw clenched and his boot inched forward. The man in the neat coat stepped out from the shadow then, his polished shoes striking the stone with a sound out of place in the wilderness. He looked like he belonged in a bank hall or a rail car, not here among dust and rifles. Yet his presence was enough to bend the posture of the riders, to remind everyone who truly pulled the strings. He raised his voice, calm and measured, cutting through the chaos with authority. He said the fee was not a matter of choice, but of law. And he spoke the word law with such weight that some of the riders lowered their rifles. Ashamed by the sound of it, the cowboy shifted slightly, letting the revolver catch the light. A quiet reminder that no law written on paper carried as much weight out here as steel in a steady hand. The tall rider snarled at the man in the coat, his loyalty balanced against fear of losing face in front of his men. The tension sharpened to a knife's edge. Back in town? The widow stood with the boys pressed close to her skirt, staring south where the horizon quivered with distant dust. Every creak of wagon wood, every bark of the dog made her flinch. She tried to steady her breath, telling herself that the boy was not alone, that the sheriff was with him, that maybe the town would rise if the worst happened. But deep down, she knew this moment was balanced on him alone. It always had been. The sheriff reached the final bend, reining hard to pull his horse up behind a rock shelf. He saw the standoff laid out like pieces on a board, each man waiting for the other to move. He counted the riders, too many. His eyes narrowed on the figure in the coat. The coin in that man's hand glinted even in the muted light. The sheriff understood then that this was bigger than cattle theft or a burned homestead. This was the whole town being carved and sold while they watched. His stomach turned, but his hand went to his rifle. The cowboy felt the air change. It always did before the first shot, like the sky itself held its breath. He knew the tall rider would not back down, not with his pride cut open in front of his men. He also knew the man in the coat would not dirty his hands with powder. That left the boy alone at the center, revolver drawn, facing the full weight of a storm. The driver whispered that they could turn back, that no cargo was worth this fight. But the boy shook his head once. Turning back would mean the town was finished, that the riders would own the roads, and the widow's land would be taken without another word. He had not crossed the wide country to turn away from a stand like this. The tall rider's hand twitched toward his holster. The cowboy's revolver rose a breath higher. The men on the ridge leaned forward, rifles gleaming. The sheriff braced his rifle against the rock, sight steady but finger frozen, knowing the first crack would light the match. The world slowed. A hawk circled high above, its cry thin and distant. The horses stamped nervously, sending small puffs of dust into the air. The driver's lips moved in silent prayer, and in the widow's kitchen, far away, a lamp flame flickered, though no wind touched it. The man in the coat lifted his hand again, his voice steady, ordering the riders to hold. But the tall rider ignored him, sneer fixed on the cowboy. He saw the boy's youth and mistook it for weakness. He did not see the steady breath, the patient eyes, the hand that had trained each morning in silence. The tall rider drew, leather scraping sharp in the stillness. And that was when time snapped. The ridge erupted in motion, rifles swinging, horses screaming. The sheriff's rifle cracked once, echoing across the cut. The stage driver ducked low, reins pulling wild. The man in the coat cursed, his voice breaking its calm for the first time. The young cowboy's revolver cleared the holster in a motion smooth as water, the barrel finding its mark before thought could catch it. But the sound of the shot, the clash that would decide everything, had not yet reached the air. The moment froze, a half-breath hanging heavy, stretched tighter than any rope. The boy's finger pressed. The tall rider's eyes widened. The sheriff shouted. The widow whispered a prayer miles away, and just before the hammer fell, the world stood on the edge of the storm, balanced between silence and fire, holding everyone captive in the space of a heartbeat. The hammer fell, and the revolver roared, breaking the stillness like lightning splitting a tree. Dust leapt from the ground, and the echo rolled down the canyon walls. The tall rider staggered, his hand still hovering over his holster but too slow to make it count. His men shouted, rifles rising, but the split second of shock cost them dearly. The sheriff's rifle cracked again from the ridge, sending one of the riders tumbling from his saddle. Horses screamed and reared, the narrow pass filling with chaos. The young cowboy did not waste a second. His revolver moved with the same precision he had drilled each dawn. He wasn't firing wild into the mass of shadows and dust. He was deliberate. Every pull of the trigger measured, every shot echoing like punctuation. The stage driver lashed the reins, and the team lunged forward, the wagon wheels rattling against the rock. The riders tried to close in, but the tight pass worked against them. They scrambled for position, colliding with each other in the panic. The man in the neat coat ducked behind a boulder, shouting orders that no one followed. His polished boots kicked at the dirt, his coin slipping from his hand and vanishing into the dust. His careful plan was breaking apart with every second, and for the first time his calm veneer cracked wide open. He realized the boy with the revolver had undone years of scheming in one single moment of defiance. The sheriff rode hard into the cut then, firing from the saddle, his weathered face set with a determination born of too many years looking the other way. This time he had chosen. His horse barreled into the fray, scattering to riders before they could aim. The cowboy and the sheriff's gunfire crossed like hammer and anvil, ringing down on the gang until the dust thickened with the sound of retreat. The tall rider, wounded but still clinging to his pride, tried to rise again, his hand fumbling toward his weapon. The young cowboy stepped close, his revolver steady at his side, and shook his head. The tall rider saw something in those steady eyes, something that told him the boy would not need to fire again. The fight drained out of him, leaving only the hollow pride of a man who had lost not just a battle, but the fear he had built his life upon. He stumbled back, clutching his side, and his men dragged him away. When the dust settled, the pass was quiet except for the moans of the wounded and the restless stamping of horses. The sheriff dismounted, breathing hard, sweat dripping from his brow. He clapped a rough hand on the cowboy's shoulder. "You held your ground," he said, his voice low, but carrying the weight of something more than praise. It was respect earned in the harshest way. The man in the coat tried to slip away down the ridge, but the sheriff caught him, pulling him out by the collar. The man sputtered about rights and law and papers stamped with seals, but his words held no weight in that canyon. The sheriff tossed the papers to the wind, where they scattered like leaves. "Law here ain't written in offices," he said. "It's written in how folks choose to stand." The man's clean coat was soon covered in dust, and his polished shoes scuffed and ruined. His power, stripped of the shadows behind it, looked thin as glass. The stagecoach rolled on, battered but upright, carrying its strongbox safely to town. When it reached Main Street, people poured from doorways, their eyes wide at the sight of the young cowboy riding in with the sheriff. The news spread before the horses even cooled. The riders had been broken. Their shadow over the town had thinned. The man behind the curtain had been dragged into the light. For the first time in months, folks breathed as if the air was truly theirs again. The widow stood on her porch when she saw the cowboy walking down the street. The two boys ran ahead, their small voices cheering, their joy uncontainable. She stepped forward slowly, her hands tight at her sides. When he stopped before her, revolver still heavy at his hip. Their eyes met in a silence filled with everything words couldn't hold. She saw not just the boy who had saved the town, but the man who had chosen to stand when no one else dared. He saw not just the widow who carried her grief with strength, but the heart that had given him a reason to fight. The sheriff held a quiet meeting in the saloon that night. The townsfolk gathered around, not with fear this time, but with hope. They agreed the riders would not return with the same power again. The man in the coat would be sent east on the next train, stripped of his schemes. The sheriff swore to protect the town's rights with more than words, and the cowboy, though he said little, was named by many as the reason the town had a chance at a future. The widow listened from the corner, her gaze never straying far from the boy who sat with his hat on the table. He didn't bask in the praise, didn't smile at the whispers of admiration. He sat quiet, steady, as if he knew the fight was only part of a larger road still ahead. He wasn't looking for thanks. He was looking for something deeper, a place where a man could finally rest his boots and know he had done right. Days passed, and the town slowly returned to its rhythm. The storekeeper no longer counted freight charges with dread. The preacher's boys laughed freely on the widow's land, chasing each other under the open sky. The piano man played tunes with a little more light in them. Even the sheriff walked with straighter shoulders, no longer carrying the shame of silence. The young cowboy helped the widow mend her fences, fetch water, and bring in wood. He worked without fuss. His revolver still by his side, but less a symbol of what might come and more a reminder of what had been faced. The widow began to smile again, small at first, then brighter, like dawn breaking after a long night. The boys followed him everywhere, their admiration as loud as their laughter. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the prairie, the widow brought out a small supper and placed it on the porch table. The boy sat across from her, his hat resting on his knee. They ate in silence at first, listening to the wind and the soft sounds of the land. Then she looked at him and said, "You could keep riding, and no one would fault you. But if you stay, there's work here, and a place to belong." Her voice trembled, though her gaze stayed steady. The cowboy looked out at the horizon, the wide country that had called him for so long. Then he turned back to her, to the home that had once been heavy with loss, but now glowed with something steadier. He gave a slow nod. Words weren't needed. The widow reached across the table, and for the first time his hand touched hers. Not the touch of desperation, but of choice. The town slept easier in the weeks that followed. The riders scattered, their power broken. The railroad man never returned, and the whispers of his plans faded into nothing. The sheriff grew old with pride instead of regret. The piano man's music filled the saloon with laughter again, and the widow's farm, once a burden, began to thrive with the help of willing hands and the promise of tomorrow. The young cowboy never sought to be a legend, but his story became one all the same. Folks spoke of the boy who had never touched a woman's hand until the day he saved a town, and of the gun that had never failed him when it mattered most. They told it by lamplight, by fire, and on long rides across the prairie. His name didn't matter much. What mattered was the choice he made, the choice to stand when silence was easier, to fight when fear was heavy, and to stay when the road still called. And as the seasons turned and the prairie rolled on under endless skies, the widow, the boys, and the cowboy built a life not from the ashes of loss, but from the steady ground of hope. Out there, where dust met horizon, the story of the young cowboy became more than a tale. It became a truth about the West itself, that sometimes a man with nothing but his gun and his courage could change the fate of an entire town. And in the quiet of each evening, when the sun dipped low and the sky burned with fire, the cowboy would sit on that porch with the widow at his side and the boys playing in the yard, knowing he had found what he had never gone looking for: a home, top of form, bottom of form.